Here's what you're about to find out. How engineers turned a flying boat into a supersonic fighter. Why the Navy thought water could replace a runway. And why the world eventually built enough concrete to make the whole idea unnecessary. San Diego Bay, January 1953. A delta-winged jet fighter sits low in the water, trailing edges touching the surface like a bird deciding whether it belongs to sea or sky. Under the fuselage, two retractable hydro skis sit folded in place. Test pilot Sam Shannon advances the throttles. The Westinghouse turbojet screams. Spray erupts behind the aircraft, the skis bite the Pacific, the nose rises, and at 125 knots the machine lifts cleanly away from the ocean. No runway, no carrier deck. Just open water, and an idea so ambitious that the Navy had already ordered production aircraft before the prototype had ever flown. The flying boat, the plane with a hole for a belly, had been reborn as a jet fighter. And like every rebirth, it started with a burial. The problem was simple. Concrete. In the late 1940s, the US Navy faced a contradiction it could not solve quickly. Jet engines were getting faster, but carriers were not getting longer. Supersonic aircraft needed thousands of feet to take off, and carrier landings were becoming a kind of controlled violence. The Navy's frontline fighters were still subsonic, straight-winged, and already obsolete against the swept-wing MiGs appearing over Korea. The Air Force had long runways and room to grow. The Navy had wooden decks and arresting wires built for propeller aircraft. Then there was the strategic fear hanging over everything. Nuclear weapons. One Soviet bomb on a carrier task force could wipe out an entire air wing. Dispersal became survival. If airfields could be cratered and carriers sunk, maybe the sea itself could serve as the safest runway. That idea was not new. In 1912, Glenn Curtiss solved the same basic problem by bolting a boat to a biplane. Curtiss had built his first motorcycle engine from improvised parts and had become a land speed record holder before he ever worked in aviation. When Alexander Graham Bell invited him into the Aerial Experiment Association, Curtiss brought an engineer's instinct to a field full of glider men. His first seaplane experiments were crude. A canoe-like hull stuck to the water instead of releasing. Then retired British naval officer John Cyril Port suggested a step in the hull, a sharp notch that would break the suction of the water at speed. Curtiss tried it in 1912, and the flying boat was born. That step changed everything. By the 1930s, flying boats had become large, luxurious ocean travelers. Pan American asked Boeing to build the biggest airliner in the world, and Boeing delivered the 314 Clipper. It weighed 40 tons, carried 74 passengers, and had a wingspan greater than many modern jets. Inside, uniformed staff served multi-course meals on linen with crystal glasses. It was less airplane than floating hotel. The Clipper proved that the ocean itself could be turned into an airport. But the same war that gave the flying boat its greatest prestige also built the thing that would replace it: concrete runways everywhere. By 1946, commercial flying boats were effectively obsolete. Land planes were faster, cheaper, and simpler. The DC-4 and Lockheed Constellation could reach the same destinations without a watertight hull or a seaplane terminal. The era of the boat-bellied airliner ended in barely a decade. The military, however, saw a different possibility. If nuclear weapons could destroy every runway and every carrier, then the safest airfield might be the one no one could bomb: the open sea. In 1948, the Navy launched a competition for a supersonic seaplane interceptor. It would have to exceed Mach 1, operate from remote bays or submarine tenders, and defend the fleet without ever touching a carrier deck. Convair entered the competition with an unusual solution: a delta-winged interceptor mounted on water skis. The design team was led by Ernest Stout, a hydrodynamic specialist who understood water the way aircraft designers understood air. His insight was simple. Instead of fighting the water with a planing hull, let the airplane float at rest, then use skis to lift it clear of the surface during takeoff. The Navy ordered 2 prototypes in 1951 and, unusually, placed a contract for 12 production aircraft before a single one had flown. The Sea Dart was assembled at Convair's San Diego plant and lowered into the bay in late 1952. Its first flight in January 1953 came almost by accident when Shannon pushed too much power during a taxi test and the aircraft simply left the water. The official maiden flight followed in April. The takeoff roll lasted only about half a minute, remarkably short for such a large machine. But the numbers also exposed problems. The intended Westinghouse J-46 engines were late, so the prototype flew with weaker J-34s. The Sea Dart was badly underpowered and could not break Mach 1 in level flight. The hydro skis vibrated so violently that cockpit instruments became hard to read. Convair redesigned the twin ski arrangement into a single ski to improve stability, but that added complexity. When the J-46 finally arrived, performance improved, but only so much. In August 1954, the upgraded Sea Dart reached Mach 1.25, and even that was only in a shallow dive. It remains the only seaplane ever to exceed the speed of sound. Then came November 4th, 1954. Test pilot Charles Richbourg took the Sea Dart up for a demonstration over San Diego Bay. Navy officials watched from shore while cameras rolled. Richbourg made a low-level pass at very high speed, lit the afterburners, and the aircraft broke apart in mid-air. Richbourg was pulled from the water, but did not survive. The crash did not kill the program instantly, but the Navy was already losing interest. The real reason was simpler. The world had built a better solution. In 1955, the USS Forrestal entered service, the first of a new generation of supercarriers. Its flight deck was long and strong enough for supersonic jets, and its steam catapults could launch them effectively. The problem the Sea Dart was designed to solve, the carrier too small for fast aircraft, had been solved by building a bigger carrier. The Navy cancelled the remaining production aircraft. The final test flights ended in 1957. 5 airframes survived. 4 went to museums. 1 sat in storage for years before being removed from inventory. The Sea Dart became a bureaucratic relic, an aircraft that had technically existed but no longer fit into the future. But the Sea Dart is only half the story. Its deeper history begins with the flying boats that came before it. Curtis's original seaplane had proven that flight without runways was possible. Port and Curtis refined the step hull idea into patrol aircraft that hunted submarines over the North Sea. Boeing then turned the concept into the luxurious Clipper, a machine that crossed oceans with sleeping berths, dining service, and the glamour of a transatlantic liner. Each generation solved the same problem in a different way. How do you fly where there are no runways? The answer changed as technology changed. At first, the sea itself was the runway. Then the sea became the route for ocean liners in the sky. Finally, concrete and steel spread across the world, and the original problem vanished. Once enough airfields existed, the flying boat had nothing left to justify it. That is why the Sea Dart failed. Not because the idea was foolish, not because the engineers were wrong. It failed because the infrastructure changed faster than the concept could survive. The Navy had asked whether water could replace a runway. For one brief moment, the Sea Dart answered yes. But the world kept building airfields and carriers until the question no longer mattered. Today, 4 surviving Sea Darts sit in museums. Their skis are retracted, their engines silent, their delta wings frozen as if they are still waiting for the tide. They are reminders of an era when engineers believed the ocean could be tamed into a runway and a jet could leap from water like a skimmer. The flying boat never really died because the idea was wrong. It died because the world made it unnecessary. From Curtis's canoe-like hull to Port's step, from Boeing's floating palace to Stout's water-skied interceptor, the line is clear. The dreams stayed the same, only the shape changed. What makes the Sea Dart story especially striking is that it sits at the exact point where 2 eras overlap. On one side is the world of seaplanes, flying boats, and naval improvisation, where designers accepted that the surface of the water could be treated like a runway if the geometry was right. On the other is the age of long concrete strips, powerful catapults, and aircraft that expected infrastructure rather than compensated for its absence. The Sea Dart was built for the gap between those worlds, and that gap closed faster than anyone expected. The airplane's water takeoff was not just a stunt. It was an attempt to solve a real military logistics problem with engineering rather than with wishful thinking. A fighter that could launch from bays, lagoons, or sheltered anchorages would not need the same network of runways and bases as a conventional jet. In theory, that meant a fleet could disperse, survive a surprise attack, and still keep aircraft in the air. In practice, it meant building a machine that had to be excellent in two environments at once, and that is a brutally hard requirement. Water is generous when an aircraft is resting, but punishing when it is trying to escape. The hull has to float cleanly, the takeoff attitude has to stay stable, and the transition from drag to lift has to happen without the airplane porpoising or slamming back into the surface. Every design choice becomes a trade-off. A shape that helps in the water may hurt in the air. A solution that makes landing smoother may add weight or complexity. The Sea Dart was an extreme answer to that balancing act, and the fact that it worked at all says a great deal about the engineering behind it. The same is true of the old flying boats that preceded it. They were never just aircraft with floats. They were systems built around geography. In the era before global runway networks, the ocean was not only a barrier, it was also a surface you could use. The big ocean liners of the 1930s did not appear out of nowhere. They were the final expression of decades of design work that had treated water as a practical part of aviation rather than as an obstacle to be avoided. That is why the Sea Dart still feels memorable even though it never entered real service. It took an old idea to its most dramatic modern extreme. A propeller-era assumption was pushed into the jet age and asked to survive. For a moment, it did. Then concrete, fuel capacity, carrier size, and geopolitical reality moved the goalposts again. The irony is that the Sea Dart was not defeated by a flaw in the principle. It was defeated by the pace of change around the principle. When supercarriers grew larger and more capable, the sea no longer had to stand in for a runway. When land-based jet fields proliferated around the world, the need for a water-launched interceptor became even narrower. The aircraft was left with an answer to a question that infrastructure had already overtaken. That is what gives the story its emotional weight. Engineers do not usually get to see the exact moment when their assumptions become obsolete. Here, the shift was visible. 1 decade, open water looked like a strategic advantage. A few years later, it looked like an elaborate workaround for a problem that had already been solved on land and at sea by other means. The test program itself also deserves attention because it reveals how unusual the Sea Dart really was. Most aircraft are proven in stages, with failures hidden behind incremental ground tests, taxi trials, and cautious hops. The Sea Dart was always going to be more exposed than that because the entire concept depended on understanding how a jet behaves while skimming and accelerating on water. Every correction to the skis, every change to the hull, and every adjustment to the engine installation was part of a larger experiment in whether a supersonic aircraft could be persuaded to begin its life at the surface of the sea. In that sense, the prototype became a data machine as much as an airplane. Its value lay not only in what it could do operationally, but in what its behavior taught designers about the limits of amphibious jet combat aircraft. The violent vibration of the skis, the underpowered early flights, and the final speed records all contributed to a clearer understanding of the design space. Even failure produced knowledge, and that knowledge helped close a chapter of aviation history with more certainty than guesswork ever could. Its surviving airframes now function as historical evidence. They let viewers see that the Sea Dart was not a cartoonish idea or a desperate improvisation. It was a serious response to a strategic environment that briefly seemed to require it. The fact that the environment changed does not make the project foolish. It makes it timely in the most fragile sense. It arrived exactly when the old problem was fading and the new solution was still being built. That is why the Sea Dart remains such a useful lesson for aviation history. It shows that even brilliant machines can be made redundant not by technical weakness, but by the success of other systems built around them. In the end, the ocean was not replaced by the runway. It was simply outcompeted by the world that grew around the runway. Its place is secure because it captures the moment when a bold workaround was overtaken by infrastructure. For that reason, the Sea Dart still matters to anyone interested in how technology evolves. Not every elegant answer survives, but the best ones leave behind a map of the problem they tried to solve. The prototype survives now as a reminder that timing can matter as much as genius. The same pattern appears again and again in aviation history. A design can be technically sound, even brilliant, and still lose once the world around it solves the larger problem in a different way. The Sea Dart belongs to that category. It was a daring machine aimed at a narrow strategic window, and when that window closed, its purpose evaporated. What remains is the record of a clever answer to a question that the future stopped asking. That is enough to keep it alive in museums, archives, and memory.